Can you see me here, everybody? Say hi if you can see me. We are live in session 2, and I'm going to invite our guests onto screen as we're live. So if you don't mind putting a note in the chat to let me know we're okay, and I can see it's all working. Stuart's here. Good news. Okay, so we're Vincent. I'm just inviting Kathy onto stage. Hello, Kathy.
Hello.
Hello, and I'm going to find Simon as well, because we do need him for this session. Hello, everybody. Sorry about that technical glitch. That is the way these things work. Okay, so I'm just waiting for Simon to join us here. As I was saying, which you all missed, this is a webinar talking about the employment law changes and their impact on the recruitment business. I've got 3 guests with me today. Well, I've got 2 at the moment. I'm going to have a third in a moment. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to wait till I can get Simon on stage. He's here right now. And once Simon joins us, I'm going to get him to chat us through some of those changes. It'd be lovely if you can, everyone's here, if you can let me know anything you want us to cover in this session today. Simon, hello. Sorry about that, everybody. Right, Simon's hopefully joining us now. Simon, I've got a little bit of a black tile for you. Can you see and hear me? Okay, I'm going to remove Simon from the stage. Do not worry, everybody. Right, while I'm doing that, Vincent, I'm going to quickly introduce you all, and then I'm going to get Simon back onto the stage. While I'm waiting for Simon, I do need Simon to do the introduction as to what we're talking about, really, don't I? Yes? Okay, wonderful. Vincent, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Good, wonderful. Simon, are you back? Yay!
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to skip the introductions. I promise I will do them. But Simon, tell us what we're talking about today, because we've got a lot of people sitting here waiting for me to crack on with this content.
Okay, well, we're talking about the Employment Rights Bill. So the last time we met was post Labour's win in the general election. And I think post King's speech, but what we hadn't seen was the actual Employment Rights Bill. So we knew what the Labour Party's manifesto said around making work pay and the intended changes to employment law. And on the 10th of October, we got to see the Employment Rights Bill, which is 170 pages of quite dry reading, even for a lawyer like me. Ultimately, the way that they're approaching it is to give quite a high level direction of the things that they are looking to amend, to change. And then sitting underneath that are going to be a number of consultations, some of which have already started, for them ultimately to get various interested parties' feedback and thoughts as to what's being proposed around some of the detail. And then they will produce draft regulations. And in the main part, the really juicy detail that we're all going to know what we're going to need to do differently, isn't going to arrive until we get the regulations, which are going to be some part next year after the consultations have concluded. And what they have said is that none of this change is going to come into effect until 2026. So there is time for us all to plan and to get used to what the changes are going to look like when we know what they do look like. But we have got the headings as things stand at the moment. And it is genuinely the biggest change to employment law in at least sort of a generation, is what they're saying. I am 27 years qualified now, and the reality is, we are moving back to being, if you think about it as a pendulum, probably you'd say that the pendulum swung in favour of the employer, and what the Labour Party and the Labour government are doing are pulling it back. They would say it's more central. Arguably, you could say it's going more to the employee's favour. So there are some things which you would expect. Nothing is a surprise because everything was in the manifesto. As I say, the detail will be where the devil is ultimately when we finally get to see that. But as a brief overview, we're seeing changes to trade union, collective consultation, and how collective voices are going to be heard in the workplace. There's a push to end exploitative 0 hours contracts and to introduce predictable hours contracts or working patterns. Going to introduce day one unfair dismissal rights. They were going to look at single worker status. That hasn't actually made it into the Employment Rights Bill. It's been pushed into the long grass, but as we'll talk about, the reality is some of the changes are going to impact on that anyway. Introduction of a single enforcement body, which we think is going to be called the Fair Work Agency, and then looking at fire and rehire and banning that as a practice. So quite big, chunky issues for them to deal with. and as I say, 170 pages of quite dry legislation to get your head around if you want to send yourself to sleep in an evening. But hopefully we will pick out the really important bits as far as the recruitment sector is concerned and start to give you a bit of insight, even though we might not be able to answer every question and give complete certainty because we've just not got the detail at the moment.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for that. And I am really happy for anybody who's got any questions to pop them in the chat. We will try and answer any questions that you have. I have some questions lined up. I'm going to bring them to our panel now. But actually, if you're watching and you've got a question you want to ask, pop it in there and I'll come to it first. So very briefly, who our panel is. So we've got Vincent from Simplicity. Vincent is Customer Director at Simplicity. He brings over a decade of expertise in finance to Simplicity, supporting recruitment businesses to scale and succeed with flexible finance and market leading back office solutions. We've got Kathy from HR Champions. She is Managing Director at HR Champions with over 21 years of HR experience and expertise in employment law. She leads HR Champions in offering flexible, outsourced HR and employment law services, including pay-as-you-go and employer guard services. And we have Simon, who you've already heard from, who is partner at Brabners, leading the recruitment and workforce solutions sector with 20 years of experience, over 20 years of experience, sorry, Simon. He and his team provide legal support across contracts, regulatory issues, acquisitions and employment law for clients at all stages of their business journey. So I guess my first question to you is, I'm going to start with you, Vincent. What do you see as the biggest challenge for the recruitment industry now that we have seen this draft bill?
Great, thanks, Louise. And thank you to Kathy and Simon for joining me as panelists today. I'm going to leave the intricate detail to them. I have the great opportunity of talking very much general. And I think this question, the answer that you'll get will be very different depending on who you ask and where they're based in the recruitment industry. But for me here at Simplicity, because we look after various different recruitment agencies that are working in different industries, the biggest challenge that we see at the moment for all recruitment agencies is that we're still in the unknown period. There's lots of things that we're talking about at the moment, and we can end up going down a little bit of a rabbit warren with some of those conversations. So the biggest piece of advice that I would look to offer to all of our recruitment agencies at the moment is to stick to what we know, stick to the facts, because there's not many of those at the moment, and let's all work together over the next couple of years, because it is going to be a bit of a roadmap as we move forward, utilising the support that we've got available. But on top of this, we've not just got the Employment Rights Bill, we've also got the new budget to contend with. So with everything that we're talking about with the new laws that are coming in, we've also got new monetary values to contend with, such as the new minimum wage and national insurance and various other things that we might need to think about as agencies. So my advice at this stage would be to have a roadmap that is strategic to you as an agency over the next couple of years, taking into consideration some of the changes that you might hear today, but also other things that are wider in the economy at the moment, so that you are prepared and you're having the communication between yourself, your supply chain and your end client. One key tip, think about your terms of business. Those are going to be the most important thing over the next couple of years between yourself and your client. Are you covered for the changes that we have ahead? And when is the right time to change those? Because at some point there's going to be some renegotiating, and that's an art in itself. So whilst that was quite a general overview, I think the key thing for me, Louise, is thinking about the next couple of years and thinking specific to you as a business and having a roadmap to support those changes.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Danny, I will come to your question in a second, but Kathy, I want to ask you the same question. And I don't know how similar your answer might be, but what would you see as the biggest challenge for the recruitment industry now?
One of my points, I think there's the biggest challenge is around the unfair dismissal claims under the sort of, at the moment we have it under 2 years, and of course that's going to come in as a day one right as they propose it at the moment. And I think for the recruitment agency, they need to work really closely with employers to ensure that we get the recruitment right the first time, because I think that employers will be really keen to make sure that they make a decision within the first 9 months, or even they might decide to do that quicker than that, maybe the first 3 or 6 months, and in which case they might want to come back and be able to claim money back from the recruiters if there's recruitment position hasn't been successful. So I think it's really important that actually there's a good relationship between the employer and the the recruitment agency to make sure that the recruitment is absolutely spot on, because I think that unfair dismissal claim is going to be sort of a bit of an issue going forward.
Okay, thank you very much. And Simon, and thank you so much for the initial overview. I mean, what would you say you see as the biggest challenge for the recruitment industry now that we know where we're going with that draft bill?
Well, I suppose it's sort of following on really from what Vincent said, which is that it's going to be change without an absolute doubt. That's inevitable. There's going to be change. And obviously, where there's change, there's potential issues and problems. I think the good thing is ultimately the lead-in period that we're getting. So, you know, we don't know some of the detail, but we are told nothing's going to really change until 2026. And as I say, I'm old enough to remember how we've previously approached legislative changes, big legislative changes, and often clients will say to me, you know, it's been a bit of a damp squib. You know, we've talked about this for ages, and I was expecting it to be this really big bang, and actually the world's continued turning and we've just carried on as we were. And the reality is because we'd spent 2 years talking and planning and changing how we approach things. And so really it is hark back to those days. But certainly if you are supplying temporary workers, contractors or umbrella employees, then this bill is going to have a major impact on how you operate your business moving forward. So as I said at the outset, one of the sort of strap lines, one of the headlines was that you know, they were going to ban exploitative 0 hours contracts, and everyone got very not excited, but probably fixated on the word exploitative. And you know, the reality is there is no real definition of 0 hours contracts. If you think about a temporary worker, they have no fixed hours in their contract. It's a sort of an as and when you need it. You would argue that an umbrella employee isn't a 0 hours contract because they generally are guaranteed 336 hours over a 12-month period. But you know, what we've seen from the bill is that ultimately when they talk about 0 hours, they mean 0 hours, i.e. no hours. There are no guaranteed hours, but also they're now talking about a low number of hours. Now, we don't know what they're going to set the low number of hours. So if you think about it, you know, in a perfect world for us, low hours would be 335 hours or less, so that umbrella employees at 336 won't be impacted by these changes. But potentially, we don't know what the definition is going to look like. Is it going to be purely 0? Is it going to include low number of hours, or what is the number of hours it will include? And obviously, there's a big campaign been running about the fact that, you know, the Labour government itself says that all this is about economic growth. They say that they understand the need for flexibility within the economy and within workers to be able to drive that growth. So the hope is that they will listen to that and ultimately bring in legislation which will reflect it. And, you know, the way things stand at the moment, as far as the bill's concerned, it says very clearly that agency workers are not going to be impacted by the legislation as it's drafted around 0 hours and also predictable hours. But what they've done is they've now launched a consultation which closes on the 2nd of December to basically ask everyone interested and involved what they think or how they think the legislation needs to be adapted so that it does apply to agency workers as well as to general 0 hours employees. And the big issue here for the recruitment industry is the drive in the legislation to look at introducing predictable hours. So under the legislation, the way it's drafted at the moment, and I really stress that at the moment, this is not how it will apply to recruiters, but we'll look at the questions as to what they want to look at about how it will. But at the moment, the way it's drafted is if someone's on a 0 hours contract or a low hours contract, after they've been on an assignment for 12 weeks, they will automatically be given the hours that they work. So if you've had someone on an assignment for 13 weeks and they've worked 40 hours every week for those 13 weeks, well, at week 12, ultimately, they then become a 40-hour-a-week employee. That is their implied terms in their contract. So no longer will there be a 0 hours that we can turn the tap on and turn the tap off as and when the business requires them to work. But in week 12, they will ultimately get the hours that they have, the hours that they've worked over the previous 12 weeks. And unlike previous suggestions of legislation, there's no application process that they have to go through. The way that it's drafted is that the employer has to give that. It happens as a matter of law. But if the employee wants to opt out, they can ultimately say, thanks very much for the offer, or thanks very much for making me an employee that's on 40 hours a week. I don't want 40 hours a week. Thanks very much. I like the flexibility, and we'll carry on as we were. So, that in practice is a really big change from what was proposed previously, where it would be an application process. The employee would say, I've been on an assignment for 13 weeks. I've been working 40 hours a week. I want you to consider giving me a contract that guarantees 40 hours a week. And the employer had lots of reasons why they could ultimately say no. And I was less worried about that, because ultimately there are lots of ability for a company to genuinely be able to say, look, the very nature of the fact that we've taken on is that we needed flexible labour supply, and therefore, we can't guarantee you 40 hours a week moving forwards. But under the new legislation, as I say, that application process doesn't exist, and you ultimately get that right automatically. And as I say, at the moment, agency workers are excluded from that provision. So at first it was sort of like, fantastic, great, that makes it easy for recruiters. However, what they've done is they've now published a consultation. Our consultation's open for response until the 2nd of December. And basically what they're asking now is, how do we amend this legislation, or how do we make this legislation work for the recruitment industry? So who will be guaranteeing the hours? Is it the agency? Is it the end client? And how do we ultimately legislate for who is responsible for that? The other bit around predictable hours is cancellation compensation. So if you book someone in for a shift and then have to cancel it at late notice, the idea under the Employment Rights Bill is that you will then be entitled to compensation for that cancellation. We don't know what the compensation will look like. We don't know what short notice will be and how you deal with the notice, because that's all detail that will come in the regulations in due course. But ultimately, again, who is going to be responsible for paying the compensation? Is it going to be the end client? Is it going to be the agency? Do they legislate so that, it depends on who's responsible? So if it's the end client changing their mind at the last minute, do they have to pay? If it's the agency that have changed their mind, the reality is that's not going to happen, because you're reliant on the client. Is the agency responsible? They don't want to interfere with contractual relationships, so what they're saying in the consultation. So the reality is likely to be that you're going to find end clients wanting to see indemnifications or contractual clauses that say that whatever the reason, any cost associated with having to compensate the temporary worker has to be borne by the agency. And again, they're asking for comments around that as well. So the consultation is not, do we want it, do we not want it? And I think if we ask most recruiters, the answer is going to be, we don't want it. And there is a free text section at the very end of the consultation where you can put that in. But the consultation is really sort of motivated from how we're going to deal with the practicalities of this legislation in the recruitment world. And what I'd really say to anyone that's affected, who get your clients involved and you as well, but ultimately respond to this consultation. The trade associations will be responding on behalf of the industry, and they're doing a really great job of making sure that the government understands the nuances that happen in recruitment. But the more people that respond, the more the voice is going to be heard. And, hopefully then that will reflect in what we end up seeing as far as the regulations are concerned about how these new laws are going to be applied within the recruitment world as far as temporary workers, umbrella employees are concerned. But it's going to be a big change if they carry down this path.
Thank you, Simon. Kathy?
I echo what Simon has to say, and I think I pick up on something that Simon said earlier about change. And I think we need to remember that this is coming from a point of addressing one-sided flexibility. And look back to when, first of all, flexible working came out, and at that time there was lots of resistance from employers about, or couldn't possibly do a job share, they couldn't do part-time working. But actually, when they were more open-minded about it and were able to think a bit more flexibly themselves, they were able to be more creative about how they could possibly make that work in their workplaces. And actually, so in lots of cases, that works really well. And part of the agenda for the government in making some of these changes is about encouraging more people to be back into work and to trying to remove the barriers that are there at the moment, or perceived barriers of why some people aren't working. They're trying to increase women returners, people who are caring, over 50s, and that's about them being able to have some predictability to their shift patterns. To enable them to be able to do the dual role of maybe caring for whoever and whatever the other responsibilities are. So whilst I think there are no doubt going to be issues, as Simon has said, that need to be ironed out, and people should have their say of where they think it's going to be a barrier to them, we also need to think about this is a bigger agenda about getting more people back into work in the UK. And we need to think openly and creatively about how we can help to make that happen.
And I like, I'm going to come to you in a minute, Vincent, sorry. And I like thinking about that positive shift in mindset and going to your clients with that and saying, this is what we've experienced before. This is where the real value is. Your relationship is not just with the client, it's with the job seeker, but this is how you can be more consultative with your clients and encourage them to think that way too. Simon, I'm going to come back to you, but Vincent wanted to tap something in then.
Yeah, only very quickly. I just wanted to pull together both of what Simon and Kathy have said. Whilst we're talking about these proposed changes, we mustn't sit here and do nothing. We don't want to be that industry in 2 years' time that we complain and say, well, I told you so. This is our opportunity to put forward our thoughts into the consultation period. If you genuinely feel that you have got some advice and feedback that would benefit the change moving forward, I cannot stress to you enough how important it is that we have our say. And, over the next few weeks, it's really important that we take this opportunity.
Simon.
Yeah, I'd echo that. And I think, what a lot of clients that we're talking to at the moment in respect of this are saying is, well, is there any point? Are they going to listen? And I don't know the answer to that. I would hope the answer is yes. But what I do know is if you don't have your say, then ultimately there's no chance of being listened to. So, even if your voice is a small voice or your voice is a big voice, all voices are relevant. And I think especially with this sector, time and time again, you would assume that government generally understands or will want to understand the nuances of how our sector works. And I will tell you from experience that they don't. And it takes us to actually sort of explain the realities of how this will impact for them to understand actually how it, or will it work in practice or won't it work in practice. And a really obvious one that they're asking the question about in consultation is, how does that impact on transfer fees? So obviously, if you supply in a temp at the moment and then your client takes on the temp on a permanent basis, most recruitment businesses will charge a fee or an extended period of hire in respect of the transfer of that temporary worker. And, linked to who's going to offer this contract, these guaranteed hours, are you going to make the agency guarantee the hours, or are you going to make the client guarantee the hours? And if the contract for the guaranteed hours is with the client, is there then a transfer, and how does that impact on the transfer fee? Can you have a transfer fee in that situation? And likewise, then again, looking at how it impacts around enforcing, if you like, end clients to take on liabilities that they might not want to at the outset. So they have got one eye open to how this impacts, but I do think we need to ultimately inform in respect of that. And I think just picking up on what Kathy was saying and echoing that, what can you do at the moment? Well, what we're doing with clients at the moment is all about the education piece. Because as I said at the outset, the reason why it's often a bit of a damp squib when this legislation comes in is because everyone's been preparing for the big day in 2 years' time, in this case. But there's no point in you preparing as an agency for what's going to happen in 2 years' time if you're not taking your client with you on that journey. And that partner approach is where I think you can use this to the advantage, because, demonstrating thought leadership, understanding, and being on the ball to your client when your competitors aren't is going to help you build, develop, and strengthen the relationship with your clients. And also, it's going to allow you to get them to respond to the consultation from their perspective and give you plenty of opportunity to work with them about how you solve the problem, how you deal with the change that we've been talking about.
Thank you. If anyone's got other questions to chip in, put them in the chat. I think we covered your question, Danny. I want to move on to the topic you brought up earlier, Kathy, which was around these day one rights for unfair dismissal claims. I think that probably sounds quite scary to recruiters. I mean, what are we really worrying about here?
Well, the rumour has it at the moment that somebody will have day one right for unfair dismissal. However, there may be sort of like a protected area of about 9 months for a probationary period, during which time maybe a lighter touch can be applied to dismissing somebody. But after that 9 months is up, that person will be fully fledged member of staff, and they'll have, unfair dismissal rights. So if you then wanted to get rid of somebody after that period of time, you'd need to go through a full performance management process. So I think from an employer's perspective, and actually I've been training on this morning, is really understanding what a good induction and probationary period looks like. Now, from some reading that I've been doing recently and some research, they're saying that people make a decision to leave an organisation within the first week of arriving there. So from a recruiter's perspective, really, really important to, as Simon said, understand who the client are, understand what their culture is, and not just be placing somebody because they think the skill sets are right, but culturally really briefing them well about what the culture of that organisation is about. So that transition is a smooth one, but working really closely with the company to give them feedback about experiences that people have had, but not just sort of superficial top level, but really having an understanding with the organization about what is the feedback that you're having, what does it mean to you, and the impact it's going to have on you and recruiting people that would be a good fit for that organization for the job role. And making sure that from the stage of somebody starting the organisation, the transition through that in probationary period is a really positive one. So keeping in touch, maybe doing some of the reviews with the employer and the employee to ensure that there isn't any clawback of any of those fees, because some of these companies are now taking a sort of a quicker route to exit when people aren't working out because they're worried about losing their fees that they've maybe paid for the recruitment agency in the first place. So I think those relationships are going to be more important than ever before, because I think it's going to be more of an integral relationship. So less sort of quick fire recruiting, but really thorough recruiting with good relationships with those employers.
And that sounds like it's a positive for both parties. It's a positive for your hiring organisation because you're working harder with them, and it's better for the job seeker as well. I'm going to read out Iva's comment, which is, can we cover day one tip service charge in effect already? What, Kathy, do you know what we're talking about here?
Day one tip service charge. So this is about gratuity, I think, if it's already in place, and this is in sort of hospitality and maybe retail where people are paid tips. Is that Iva? Is that right?
Sure. Yeah, I don't know whether that is. Iva, can you put a follow-up? I wondered whether it was on day one, whether you gave them a boost for staying for the whole day. I don't know. No, Iva says it's correct. So day one tip service charge. Is this to do with earnings?
I think this is to do where you go into a restaurant and you pay a tip, and some organisations will have creamed off some of that tip and saying that only 50% of it goes to the staff and they keep the other 50% and whatever their rules are. So what's come in this year is that tips and gratuity need to go to the employees, and the organisation needs to make sure that they have a very fair and equitable way of sharing that. They have a policy for it that's conveyed to staff, and then all the staff get all the tips. So it's a reward for them. They might still do the manager and the chefs and as well as the waiting staff, the whole full service of it, but they need to have clarity of that within the organisation. It needs to be reflected, I believe, on somebody's sort of pay slip as well, because it's earnings. But there is actually, if I've got this right, there's also a caveat in the new consultation that's happening around actually that they need to consult with staff going forward about how the pay, the tips and gratuities done in the future. So there's a new enhancement we're waiting to come in as well sometime in the future.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm going to see whether Vincent wants to take this one, and I'm going to come to you, Simon, if he's less keen. This is from Danny. Do you think agencies may even get busier if as if agency temp workers are able to still have 0-hour contracts, then employers may decide to go down the agency route to avoid day one rights. And it does make sense, Danny. I don't know what you think, Vincent.
So we have had various different opinions on this, depending on the agencies that I talk to. But I guess in essence, the majority are seeing this as a potential opportunity moving forward for business development activity, depending on how this might go. Does this swing more into a fixed term contract? What might it look like? So I think there could definitely be an opportunity for sure.
I like the way of thinking. Simon?
Just to add, I think, well, I suppose it depends what happens with the consultation around predictable hours and sort of compensation around late cancellation. But if I were, and it depends where they set, how high they set the low hours bar. But if, for example, they set any hours over 335 hours, then I think what we'll see is lots of agencies move away from temporary worker status. It goes to Danny's question earlier. They'll move away from temporary worker status and move to employment status, a bit like an umbrella employee at 336 hours, and then be able to still supply in without the sort of extra layer of burden, if you like, around exploitative and predictable hours, because I think the day one rights are going to be easier to manage potentially than the predictable hours part of the changes that are happening. But that's part of where we need to see the detail before we can say for sure, because there's no point running 1,000 miles an hour. So, for example, when we looked at the legislation when the bill came out, doesn't apply to agency workers. Fantastic. Yes, let's all go down that path. But 2 weeks later, here's a consultation where we are going to plan, or we want to work out how we apply it to agency workers. And as I say, the consultation is geared very much on it will apply to agency workers, not do you think it should or do you think it shouldn't apply. Now, of course, it's entirely possible for the government to say, well, we've listened to all the consultation and it won't apply to agency workers moving forward. But I wouldn't bet money on that as an outcome at this moment in time. But, you know, as I say, that's part of we don't really know what we can do until we get the detail, because otherwise it becomes a bit like whack-a-mole. You know, you sort of like hit it over here but you create a problem somewhere else. So we need to see the full picture and then we can start to do some planning. But I do think, you know, we're a creative industry, a creative sector. There is a solution to this, and there will be a solution that we find, without a doubt. And the other thing that some clients are talking about, and I'm not saying this will happen, but it's interesting. This change in legislation combined with the increase in employers' national insurance, you know, are some clients who were very anti-IR35 and basically said everyone needs to be inside IR35 and paid through PAYE. Will the sort of noose, if you like, loosen so that more people are more willing to look at outside IR35, because you get the saving then in respect of the employer's NI, as well as avoiding some of the issues around what we're talking about now in respect of employment. But there is still the big issue of IR35 at the other side of the fence.
I'm going to come to Ian's question in a minute. Somebody has just WhatsApped me a follow-up to your comment, Kathy. Obviously doesn't want to write this in the chat, but we're talking around this you know, the change to day one rights, and they said to me that the issue isn't with the clients, the issue is within the recruitment agencies of not always having the best culture. So actually the impact on actual recruiters joining a recruitment agency, where there can actually be a really high turnover of staff, and recruitment businesses relying very heavily on a probation period. I mean, it's a bit of a bad question to ask you, but do you think it'll help us clean up our act internally as well?
Well, I think that any environment where you've got high sales driven people, it's about earning the money and the commission rather than actually sometimes the quality of what you're doing. And I think anything that can improve that, if the organization's culture is like that, can only be a good thing, because then we're going to get more successful placements than we have before. But equally, I would hope that some of that is already being realized, because as an employer, if you were having somebody that was just doing any old placement with you, then surely you would deselect from using that recruitment agency going forward, because they're not staying, and it's sort of a slapdash approach. And I think that does happen occasionally where there's volumes that are being recruited, but a meaningful recruitment advisor is going to do a good job of it for you.
Yeah. Okay, Ian's question.
Also add to that as well, just Louise, a second, is that some of the HR directors we're speaking to from recruitment clients are concerned about the impact it'll have on the work that they've done around DE&I. So, they struggle at the moment to convince hiring managers to go for recruiters that don't fit within the very standard sales makeup of a sort of the skills and the background. They've got a very fixed idea of who will be fantastic at a sales recruitment type role, and they've spent a lot of time and energy trying to widen that view to try and sort of increase their sort of diversity and their inclusion. And their genuine concern is that the hiring managers are going to use this to say, well, actually, no, we'll just stick with what we know, thanks, because we know that will work, and we don't want to take a risk on that. So, whether that will come to bear, I'm not sure, but certainly a lot of the HR directors we're talking to in the recruitment industry are worried that within their own recruitment businesses, that could be an unintended consequence of this.
I can see that. This feels like a Vincent question because it's got the word calculator in it. And it says, is there a way to build a calculator where we can work out clients' total yearly spend on perm hires with agency fees and NI, etc.? Then have it split out here, 3 options: temp, retainer, perm, so you can show a yearly picture. I like this idea. How feasible is it, Vincent?
So I love this idea, and Ian, thank you so much for teeing this one up. So at the moment, we have a margin calculator that's available for everybody to use online. We are creating another version of that, which will incorporate all of what's to come over the next 12, 24 months. So yes, keep an eye out for that. If anybody is using our calculator at the moment and feels that there's extra bits that they'd like to see, please do feed that into me, because we're currently working on developing a new version of that for next year. So if we can, we'll definitely build it into version 2.
Fabulous. So that was perfect. Okay, Vincent, I'm going to stay with you because I've got a different question entirely, which is, what do you think to the potential of a new governing body that might cover the umbrella network?
Okay, so juicy question. But personally, for me, and this is my personal opinion, I love the idea of a new governing body to govern the recruitment industry. We need some consistency, and the recruitment agency needs to be able to rely on a governing body to create consistency, not just in the umbrella network, but there's quite a lot of work to do there. I know we have others out there that are working very hard to create some consistency, but the bit that's missing for me is accountability, which I really hope comes with a new governing body. We've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly here at Simplicity because we have almost 500 agencies that we're working with. So we see a lot of things happen week in, week out. And quite a lot of the time, when things go wrong, it goes wrong because an agency is working with somebody within their supply chain that hasn't done something that they might have needed to have done at the time, whether they knew or didn't know at the time. So I think for me, it's about having the consistency, but more importantly, the accountability to make sure that what they're trying to govern is done.
Does the FCSA slightly do this already?
Yeah. So the FCSA, to be a member of the FCSA, you have to undergo an annual audit or assessment, and that's both from an accountancy and a legal perspective. So the compliance levels should be higher because it's an expensive membership to buy because you ultimately have to pay for those assessments to take place, but those assessments are undertaken by independent accountants and lawyers. It's not perfect because obviously you're only looking at a snapshot in time, but it is a lot better than not having. And certainly, FCSA is something that you should be thinking about from a PSL perspective, or it drives up compliance standards. And then the other thing that was announced in the budget, and you would have missed it unless you were a dweeb like me, and I had it on the background and just heard her say anti-avoidance and umbrella, and that's all she said in the actual budget announcement. But the plan is that in the finance bill 2025, which will come into effect in April 2026, they're planning to change the rules so that the recruitment business, if there is an employment agency in the supply chain, will be responsible, legally liable for any HMRC PAYE. So ultimately, the recruiter needs to make sure that the umbrella that they're partnering with is doing things in a compliant fashion, and that there are constraints and restrictions there, because otherwise, it's not like chasing the debt through the supply chain. It just will be that the recruitment agency will be legally liable to pay any underpayment of PAYE, and if there is no recruitment agency, then it will go straight to the end client in respect of that. So that's quite an effective sweeping change that perhaps avoids the regulatory bit of it, that actually has the same sort of impact. Personally, I think it would have been better if the end client had some skin in the game, a bit like IR35, because they will be the ones that could drive non-compliance to get a better cost, a better price. Yeah. And it's the agency that ultimately is left holding the liability. Whereas I think if they included the end client, then they would have had some skin in the game to make sure that that supply chain was compliant.
Cool. I've got a few more questions. If anybody else has got a comment they want to put in the chat, please do, because I'm happy to take yours. Kathy, I see you have exactly the same problem as me, which is their sun is actually out.
I don't want to block it out, but because it's lovely and warm, but it's sort of brightening me up. I do actually have just a point on the back of Simon's. There's also in the proposal for the Employment Rights Bill, the improvement enforcement of workers' rights. So they've also talking about a Fair Work Agency, which is also a group that's going to be, or proposed to be set up, that's going to bring together the monitoring process. So like with national minimum wage, the HMRC at the moment, this will look to bring together existing state enforcement functions and take on enforcement of a wider range of employment rights. And it'll be a single place of contact for both workers and employers. So that's quite interesting to see how that will affect some of the other bodies that are already there or are proposed, because maybe it'll be one great big umbrella with everything underneath it.
We haven't really talked about the minimum wage increase. Is that something which recruitment agencies specifically have a concern about? Vincent, you did a very small nod then. I'm going to make you answer.
Yeah, of course, because that's going to put the cost price up. So it's definitely something that agencies need to take into consideration, because they're going to need to renegotiate with the end client, because the cost of work is going to go up. So it's a very simple change, but the impact that it's going to have is going to be vast. It'll be different for every end client, depending on the level of cash flow that we've got going through the business. But if you think about the cost of employment at the moment, there's only a few months remaining before that goes up. Obviously, that should only really impact those that are on a minimum wage or national living wage, should we call it. But then there is going to be a requirement to assess those levels of pay across the board. So I think it's going to be quite a big change for the agencies to think about when looking at taking on new contracts moving forward, but also ensuring that their profit margin remains healthy with what they've currently got on the books at the moment.
Kathy, I think that Danny's follow-up question is for you, which is, were you talking about a replacement to ACAS?
I don't believe it is a replacement to ACAS. I think it's a separate agency. Is that your understanding, Simon? Yeah.
Yeah, so it's basically bringing together the Employment Agency Standards Inspectorate, which is the regulator that looks after the agencies, the GLAA, which looks after the sort of agricultural, horticultural, and food production agencies, and then, as Kathy says, the sort of HMRC and NMW. I think, the debate at the moment is which approach will it take. The Employment Agency Standards Inspectorate, their approach is much more collaborative. They'll come in, they'll look at what's happening. They'll normally give you a 14-day improvement notice to sort things out that they've discovered that aren't done in compliant way. Whereas the GLAA is probably more used to dealing with the more sort of difficult situations. So they take a more sort of bombastic approach, ultimately, I think, to regulation enforcement. It will be an interesting one to look how that plays out, because they will have wider powers, so they'll be able to go in the whole supply chain, is my understanding, and look at collective things like if holiday pay is not being paid correctly, if NMW is not being paid correctly, if there's an issue with modern slavery. So it's to bring together all those sort of different enforcement. And to be fair, it's been talked about for a while, and they do talk a lot at the moment, and it's not a coincidence that if you get a visit from one regulator, you'll probably, like buses, have one from all of them within a relatively short space of time.
That's cheerful. Simon, you were talking about the rough sort of timeline for some of this, and I was going to ask you about when the next stage of details is. Can you give me a bit more on that?
Yeah, so I think the reality is, as near as we can get will be sometime in 2025. So, for example, there are, I think, 3 consultations open at the moment that are all due to end on the 2nd of December.
Okay.
So what will happen is that consultation will go into the government, into Whitehall. That will be analysed, reviewed, released. I suspect then quite quickly after that we will see a draft set of regulations. There will be then opportunity to feed back on those regulations before a final set of regulations are issued, and then it will be a matter of implementation from there. So I keep saying to clients, it's a sort of a marathon, not a sprint. That that there will be, you've got to keep on top of this because it will change, and you can't just simply dip in and think that nothing will change. You've got to sort of keep track of it. But the idea, as I say, the final end point is going to be 2026. The 1 year unfair dismissal, they're saying autumn of 2026. So I really feel probably in the first quarter of next year we'll start to see some of the detail and start to understand how the jigsaw's all going to come together.
I can tell you this, that for the Agency Expo, I've had quite a few people submit talks on this topic. So I suspect that in March, we'll be talking about it. And you mentioned the 3 consultations a couple of times. I think that I've seen like most of the governing bodies involved. I saw a lovely picture of Neil Carberry outside 10 Downing Street. He looked like he was with a bunch of carol singers, the way they were all posed. But I'm assuming it was to do with this. So I guess if you're a member of a governing body like the REC, APSCO, team, they're all having those conversations. And then if you're also working with other partners who are interested like yourselves, I guess it's worth having those conversations that way too.
Yeah, I think there's, unfortunately, it's that sort of period of time where there's lots of talking, not a lot of action, but actually the talking will ultimately influence and impact on what we end up having to action. So it's like I was saying earlier, you can't, well, people will criticize what we end up with. I've got no doubt about it. But ultimately, if they've not had any input to it, then really, this is the time to have your voice heard. And I hope it is heard. But all you can do is try and get it out there at the moment. But yeah, I saw that picture as well of Neil and the rest of the delegation, and it did look like they were singing carols.
I started to answer this question I'm asking you, Vincent, which is about what support is available for recruitment agencies. So I guess I've mentioned the governing bodies, but what else is there apart from webinars like this?
Exactly, Louise. So I think, first of all, what you said there is absolutely right, because I was sat here thinking, how do our audience know how to have a voice? And I think you hit the nail on the head there. Using those governing bodies to get your feedback in is the right way to go. And then to get some support, sometimes it's a little bit like asking your best friend if you look good in an outfit. Don't go and ask the person that's going to say yes anyway. Make sure that you surround yourself with a partner network where you're going to get honest and frank feedback. Take this as an opportunity to evaluate your business. There's going to be a huge amount of change coming forward, as we've all said. This sounds like a stuck record, I'm sure, but really take this as an opportunity to make sure you're fully prepared. And kind of do a little bit of a SWOT analysis on your business. So think about the different things that might happen, and would that be an opportunity to you, or would it be a threat? And then try and have a contingency plan for both. And then reach out to all of the networks that are available. There is a huge amount of people in this industry that are all ready and waiting to support. Take advantage of that free advice. There's so much of it. We're all happy to help and provide advice and guidance. So I guess really, in a nutshell, use the governing bodies to have your say. Make sure you have your say. Reach out to those that are ready and available to support you, and have a plan.
That is absolutely perfect. Now, we are at 50 minutes, and I am happy to take final questions. If you've got a final question, not on the stage, off the stage, put it in the chat. Let me know what it is. Because what I'm going to do now is going to ask everybody really what they think the benefits are and the opportunities are for recruiters. I'm going to come to you first, Simon, because I think you spoke last. What do you think the potential benefits and opportunities are for the recruitment industry?
I think it will inevitably drive up the compliance levels. And I think, that's what the consistent theme over the last 20 odd years that I've been working with recruiters and in the recruitment industry. For lots of different reasons, the common theme to the calls, the inquiries that we get is, how is a competitor able to do things at the rate that they're doing it at? And the answer always is, no matter what the question is, that it's because they're not compliant. They can't be doing things correctly because that the cost is the cost. And I think it'll drive up compliance standards and hopefully create consistency across the board. And that is, I think, good for the industry because it will push out those that are cutting corners and doing the industry a disservice and actually promote those recruiters that have compliance at the heart and are doing a good job and are doing the right thing in respect of both the candidates and the clients. So I think that's the positive. I think, the inevitable is it's going to be a period of change, but I think, that's what will come out of it at the other end.
Kathy, what would you add to that?
I think that we should expect that there'll be a certain amount of change in anything that we do. And actually, we need to make sure we're not like a stuck record. And just because we've made maybe lots of money or we've been happy with what we've done in the past, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't adjust and change. And the world is evolving around us. So I think it's about having an open mind and really doing that analysis that Vincent said really thoroughly. What are your strengths? What's your business strengths? And how can you play to those going forward? And like when Simon says about compliance versus commission, is that the right way to be running your business? Is it, how do we make sure that the culture in your own organisation is the right one going forward to be able to deliver the best job for your customers and your clients? I think there are a few other benefits. There might be some more sort of try before they buy from the employers. They might want to do a bit more temp to perm working to make sure they've got the right people in. And if you're not doing that, that might be an opportunity to do that going forward, or to find a way of doing that works well with some collaborative working during that try stage.
Love all that. Vincent, what have you got to add?
So just very briefly, I think this is going to create consistency, as both Kathy and Simon have said. But for me, I'm focusing on the candidate experience. I'm really hoping that some of these new laws will increase that experience from day one, because hiring managers are going to have to work harder. You can no longer sit back and think, oh, well, never mind, if it doesn't work out, I've got 2 years. And I know that people think that. We might say that we don't, but we do. So I think it will ensure that the onboarding experience for new candidates into businesses is much better than it has been before. But it will also give businesses the opportunity to pivot through that exercise of understanding what their strengths and weaknesses are and the potential threats that might come ahead. It might force people to change the direction of their business so that they can increase the opportunity of business development. And finally, please have your say. That is a massive benefit to us at the moment in this industry. Don't let the opportunity run out without having your say if you've got something to say.
So in summary, we're talking about what you can do is keep up informed. Make sure you are joining events like this. Make sure you're talking to your governing bodies. Make sure you're talking to your partners. Make sure you're talking to people who are not an echo chamber. Do a SWOT analysis, see where your business lies at the moment, what strengths and opportunities are. And I totally agree with the positives. Improving compliance, pushing up standards, maybe more temp to perm, utterly love that, and a more positive candidate experience. And Danny, I agree. It's been a tough few years in recruitment, absolutely. And I can see why many recruiters would see this as, oh no, not more things to changes, negative changes. But I do really believe there's opportunities here. And hopefully those of you who've been watching live have understood a little bit more about what we think about and a little bit more about what the opportunities are. After this, so those of you who watch live, we're going to send an email out. Those of you watching a replay, thank you for joining us there. Like I said, this is going to go out on LinkedIn as well. I'm pretty sure the Simplicity crew will be sharing it on your blog. And I will make certain that everyone's contact details are shared. Vincent, you organised this for us. Is there anything you want to close with?
I'd like to close with a huge thank you to you, Louise. I don't think you ever get any thank yous live on stage, or certainly I haven't heard anyway. So thank you for bringing this together and being a fantastic, shall we say, overview of making sure that we do everything we should do when we're a panelist on stage. So thank you for being the most amazing host. Thank you to Kathy and Simon and our other partners that joined us in episode 1. We will continue to organise these events moving forward, but this is episode 2 of 2. So there's not a third one to look out for. And thank you to our audience. We've had over 80 registered participants for this session and a similar amount to the first one. So really do hope that it's helped.
Thank you very much, everybody. Simon, you've been fabulous. Kathy, you've been amazing. Vincent, always a pleasure to work with you. And Vicky in the background. And again, thank you to our audience. And yeah, we'll make sure we share those details. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.